Welcome, everyone, to the 30-minute Midas touch from beautiful Dyersburg, Tennessee at the Herb Welsh WrestlePlex. Now, here is pound for pound and inch for inch, the best of the best in professional wrestling today. A wrestling genius worth his weight in gold. The Golden Boy, Greg Anthony.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 30-minute Midas touch. I am your host, the Golden Boy, Greg Anthony. And with me, as always, is my co-host, methodical.
Oh,
Mark Tipton.
methodical. I like that. That's nice. And I appreciate to see how this one's going to get weaved into the subject matter. I do like that. Methodical. I always like the methodical pace. I have heard that. I've heard that applied to wrestlers. I won't say. It seems like something Gordon Soley would. I would have heard him say.
It was applied to me many times.
Yes. And certainly I don't take it as anything less than a compliment, so methodical. But to get to the subject matter of this week's edition of the 30-minute Midas Touch podcast is that we want to discuss, in kind of an overview, I suppose, in a general way, we want to discuss professional wrestling territories.
Yeah, and the reason I wanted to dive into this topic this week is because there's this thought process in social media or just in general that I think that anything and everything that ever happened in a territory was good. And that's not my case. You know, like I understand there was bad. But the silly and the bad and the just the ridiculous and the stuff that makes sense back in the territory days made up about 1% of professional wrestling. Now it makes up about 90% of professional wrestling, if we're true about it. So that's kind of where my thought process has always been. But like the territories themselves, there's my favorite type of professional wrestling is territory style wrestling. You know what I mean? Because to me that resonates more with myself. It resonates with the individuals in those particular areas. It's kind of a community pride kind of thing almost. You know, obviously here in Memphis, you know, we can see that with the Lawlers and the Dundees and the Handsome Jimmies and the Rock and Roll Express and all the guys that came through Memphis that were big stars, and how intricate they are to just the culture here in West Tennessee.
Okay, yeah. When I was thinking about this, I guess because I liked your approach. You said you want to, admit there were flaws, of course, and I guess it's the response you get sometimes when you talk about pro wrestling territories is you get people respond as though you're doing the good old days kind of thing. Well, back in the good old days, it was like this, or in my day, it was like that, and you get the kind of boomer kind of reaction from people. Okay, boomer, that kind of thing, and that's really not what it's about. It's about an approach and a viewpoint on professional wrestling. Is when I hear that, that's what I'm thinking about. I understand the practicalities of television and all those sorts of things, and the way the business has gone in that. But there is an appreciation for territories, the way they approached it, the esteem with which they held professional wrestling, and which is all too often missing. Is that basically where you were going with it?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, and the thing is too, like I said, not everything was perfect. They made plenty of mistakes. There's plenty of territories that fell on hard times and end up having to close their doors and things like that, and they made mistakes. But for the most part, what you're talking about is they all lived in the same world. Does that make sense? Like, even though Memphis was different from Detroit and Detroit was different from San Francisco, it was all still professional wrestling, and it all made coherent sense within each other. Now, could Jerry Lawler have gotten over like he did in Memphis and San Fran? Probably not. But like that's the beauty of the territory. Not only could we have 30 top guys, 30, 60 top guys, you know what I mean? Instead of one territory that had just one, or what we're dealing with now, we have basically two major companies. You know what I mean? And who's on top? We don't know.
Mm-hmm. I do like that, and I will indulge in a little bit of my fondness, because when I think about territories, I remember once upon a time going to, well, it was usually Kroger, but going to a store and seeing the National Wrestling magazines on the shelf. And like if you want to know what was going on in other places, that was your primary source. That was how you learned what was going on here, there. There were great things happening in other parts of the country that you may not have had access to by any means other than the Pro Wrestling Illustrateds, etc. And so, they would always make the top 10 list. There would be photos from ringside recounting great matches, etc., and so forth. And so it kind of built a mystique around professional wrestling. You knew this thing happened everywhere, but it wasn't so easily accessible. And there's kind of a fond nostalgia viewpoint from me on that when you talk about territory days.
Yeah. Like I said, the territories are my favorite thing just because it all made sense to me. Like if you're WWE, for instance, I said this before, like a lot of people want to credit Vince McMahon with killing the territories. And in my opinion, the territories kind of killed themselves because they try to compete with Vince. Vince couldn't have been everywhere all the time. You know what I mean? He couldn't have spent, 12 months a year in Minnesota, competing with Vern.
Right. He would come into town and then...
Yeah,
much like they do now.
So what they should have done is they should have backed up and fortified their territories, and I think a lot of them would have lasted a lot longer.
Okay.
And same thing with Vince. Vince would, he would buy television time, out from under the guys. Well, guess what? There was 3 channels back then.
Yeah.
He's not going to buy everyone on every channel.
No.
And if he did, every territory should have done that and made him go bankrupt, and they would have won the war anyway.
Right.
But that was hindsight 2020. People were just thinking, oh, here this smart kid is trying to take over our business, blah, blah, blah. He doesn't know what he's doing. We'll show him. And they didn't realize the kind of thought process that he had at the time. So, yeah, the territories, and the territory's biggest thing was creating stars. You know what I mean? Who's the next guy? You know what I mean? And where territories usually faltered was when they had the same guy that was on top way too long, whether it be 5 years, 10 years, or something like that. But like Lawler, for instance.
Right.
Lawler
well, you read my mind.
Lawler went back and forth. Like sometimes he was on top, sometimes he wasn't, but like he was always Jerry the King Lawler. Every once in a while he'd get the Southern Heavyweight title back and do this with this guy or something. But then sometimes he'd be in just heated programs with Dundee or, whoever else. And what I mean by that is like Dick the Bruiser. Dick the Bruiser was another example. Like he was in every main event for WWE, I think, for decades.
Okay.
And after a while, it just got boring.
Okay.
And people had seen it, So, and that's why his territory started dying off.
Well, there you're talking about a business philosophy, and change is inevitable, and so to a certain extent, you have to embrace it. I don't want to say just change for change's sake, but there is such a thing as being able to kind of mix things up a little bit, and ideally with I'm going to use the word smaller scale organization that the territory would have, they could be more responsive and change the direction of the company easier than you could with a larger, we'll just say WWE. WWE at this point is viewed in, I think, 100 countries, translated into multiple languages. Making major moves there is a long-term process. You don't just unmake all that. Mm-hmm. Whereas a territory promotion could be a little bit more nimble and change the way they do things in response. Is that
kind of sort of like WWE? Actually, when people don't realize, is WWE is actually it's a territory itself. It's just their territory is the entire world. But the same basic principles of a territory still apply to WWE. There has to be good versus evil. It has to be created in a format of urgency. Like this is a competition between these two guys, and when, like I said before, when we get too far away from that, it's that much harder to get back to it. But all the tried and true stuff that we learned in the territories, all that stuff, people just think, oh, they just made it up. No, they tested and tried stuff out, and this is what they ended up with. It was a polished out thing to where, hey, this is what works for our business. And for some reason, there's guys nowadays that go, nah, let's try it this way. It's like, I understand, like you said, change is inevitable. There's always going to be something to change the business. Television changed the business. The internet changed the business. Streaming now has changed the business. All those kind of things, obviously technology plays a huge role in that. But like the same basic principles for professional wrestling should still be the same as it was 50s, 60s, 70s. You know?
Okay, I guess to try to expand on this is one of the things that always stood out to me was I'm going to say the word styles, but the different presentations of professional wrestling. Going from territory to territory, the way professional wrestling was presented could vary fairly widely. A type of match and or performer that would work in one place would not necessarily work in another. Obviously, our proximity to Memphis, it makes us a little more knowledgeable of that. And I'll just say this: like when I would see Bill Dundee, uh, run to the corner, spring off the second rope, do a crossbody and pin. For my viewing of wrestling at that point, that was highly technical wrestling to me. Because Memphis is a personal feud, trade right hands, blood spattered, no DQ, we're going to go at it, that kind of thing. There wasn't a whole lot of time invested in
Catch can.
Yes, there it is. Whereas there were other territories where those things were emphasized. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and that's part of the appeal of me to the territories. Like you said, there was variety. There was vanilla, there was chocolate, there was strawberry, there was Rocky Road, there was all these different flavors, but it was all still ice cream. You know what I mean? Nowadays, you don't know what you're going to get when you go to professional wrestling. It may be ice cream, shit. It may be sushi. We don't know. But yeah, like like you said, Memphis was not known as a catch can wrestler's wrestler kind of thing. That's why Dundee did so well. It's because he was one of the few guys that did that. Billy Robinson when he came through, and certain guys that came through would go. Tony Charles, that was another guy that was in the Memphis area that could do all that stuff. But like that was very few and far between. Like you said, blood and guts, heated angles, that kind of thing. Now if you went up to AWA and Verns, he was very legitimate amateur wrestling background, that kind of Olympian kind of format, that kind of thing. So he liked that. Down in Florida, it was similar with the Grahams, Eddie Graham, and actually we've been, I've been showing my students a bunch of Mike Graham here recently because he was phenomenal and he don't really get a lot of the credit he deserves. He's surprisingly how good he actually is if you watch some of his stuff. But then you go up into the Mid-Atlantic, and the Mid-Atlantic was actually known as a tag team territory, where, the tag team match was usually on top. So that was different. So if you were a professional wrestling fan, think about if there was a territory system today connected with a streaming service, right? And you had 30 territories that had it was all wrestling, and it all made sense in the same world, but there was those different styles that you could go, I like that, I like this more, and that you could pick 5 or 6 that you wanted to keep up with. And then when someone from your second one showed up on your fourth one, you'd be, oh shit, look at that. You know what I mean? You'd be super impressed, right? So like, to me, there's still a huge misconception about how good the territories are for the business overall.
Yeah, I did like the point you made because when a territory had a style, it allowed them to stand out. Now, I mentioned Dundee, and ultimately it was because his use of the ropes at all. The ropes, when you watch match from the Mid-South Coliseum, the ropes were not a major part of the... it was mostly 2 guys slugging it out. Occasionally go on the floor, and they'd use that big blue table they had it.
Right.
It was the most solid-looking table I'd ever seen, and they would...
And Lawler proved that when Joe LeDuc threw him 40 feet into that solid table and about killed him.
Yes, I do remember those days fondly. But that made him stand out. And then as I'll say like when the Superstation came along, and I had a chance to see a wider variety, and I got to hear the Gordon Solis, and he would always talk about the human game of chess, I believe was his phrase, among other things, and just a different approach and viewpoint on it, and it just expanded everything for me, which has continued to expand. And I suppose I would say and this would be a good way of something for you to answer now, if you're a professional working your way up and you have all these different venues that have different presentations, does that give you the chance to improve your skills?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing it does though is a lot of people. Another misconception is, um, so the stars, you know, they traveled anyway. Like the Funks, and the Briscoes and Andre and guys like that. They were never really, plopped in one specific territory. They traveled quite a bit and made different rounds because they were big enough names in professional wrestling they could do that. Then the territories themselves had people that were just stars locally, and to me that's a very novel concept for what you're doing. I mean, think about that. Like, okay, yeah, we've got our own homegrown stars here, but then we've also got these guys that will work for us that travel around the country, and also guys that can come in that are on top, and stuff like that, and it just keeps everything kind of fresh and up to date. One of the problems with the territory, like I said, it was just the overall. It was very shady in the sense of when the owner was the booker and the top star and stuff like that. It skews your viewpoint a lot, and but at the same time, if you're an owner and you're a booker and you're the star, then you can trust yourself. You don't have to worry about so and so stabbing you in the back and taking your title to so and so because you're that guy. Right, so that it's kind of a 6 in one hand, half a dozen the other. But I mean, there's a case to be made for both sides of the coin.
Okay, well, I like as you were talking about that, the idea that sprang to my mind, or the example that sprang to my mind was, we talked about Jerry Lawler stayed on top in Memphis for such a long time, and it worked really well. It's not a criticism; it was just the person that sprang to my mind was Austin Idol.
Right.
Austin Idol was a talent who would come into town from time to time and always entertaining. The fans always reacted well. But I did hear Lawler refer to Austin Idol on more than one occasion as, and I think this was half joking. He would refer to him as a guy who has no-showed more promoters than George Jones. Now,
wow.
for those of you that don't remember the country singer George Jones, this is the younger members of the audience may not remember him, but he had some personal issues that prevented him from making all his scheduled dates for appearances at his concerts. And so Jerry Lawler, obviously aware of this, made comparisons that. Now when he would say it, it always stuck out to me. But Austin Idol was someone who always drew a response when he came to town. But it did make sense to me why his stays generally weren't long ones. But do you think that's kind of the promoter's point of view that Jerry Lawler's expressing there?
Kind of, sort of, yeah. And the thing is, too, like, some guys just are not going to be punctual. They're not going to keep their dates. They're not going to do this. And it's hard to do business with those guys. And it really depends on how worthy they are, how talented they are, if you're going to continue to use them. If someone that sucks does that, you're never going to use them again, right? But someone like Austin Idol that was a proven commodity,
yes,
whether in the main event or on the undercard,
right,
he was someone you could maybe let it slide every once in a while.
Sure.
But you don't want to create an atmosphere of it's 100% okay to do that.
Yeah.
Another thing, too, there's guys that just did bad business, but I don't think they understood how they did. Like, there was a story with Lawler and Paul Heyman where Lawler had booked this scaffold match, right? And Heyman was all for it, building up to it. And then the night they get to the building, Heyman says he can't do it. He's scared of heights.
Oh.
And Lawler's like, well, what the fuck are we supposed to do? You know what I mean? We built this up for weeks, and so I think he ended up punching Paul Lee on the floor and broke his jaw.
Oh, okay.
So, but that's what we call a receipt in professional wrestling. You've done something that may damage the overall business,
sure,
of the company. So you need to pay forth.
Okay. Yeah, and I I do want to be careful. That's not a criticism of the universal heartthrob.
No, no.
It's just a phrase I heard said. And
Dude,
I've heard
he still has that reputation. That's one of the
Okay.
reasons he's never been to Dyersburg is
Okay.
because I don't want to
take that chance.
take that chance. Yeah.
Okay. But that does open up opportunities because I could see where some performers may say, hey, I like to travel around because it allows me to keep things a little fresh. I go and spend X number of weeks. I come into Memphis, work with Lawler with X number of weeks. Then I move to Mid-South or World Class or whatever. Move on somewhere else. And I could see how that would, kind of open up opportunities for wrestlers. And ultimately, I mean, is it not fair to say that with the territories, you have more places for more guys to work, and you, in the end up, the cream rises to the top regardless of the place, I'm sure. Then you end up with a wider variety of talented professional wrestlers to portray, and as they travel around, it ends up better for the fan in general.
Yeah. And that's kind of the big thing too. Like, and we talk about it, if there was a territory today, well, the problem with the territory today would be that they don't draw enough to sustain a company like was in the original territories. I mean, most of those territories were drawing at least 10,000 people to one big weekly show and then spot shows along the way. Most, I'm not going to say all, because I mean, obviously like the Garden, for instance, they ran once a month, but Memphis drew the Coliseum, every Monday. Every Monday night. Mondays in Memphis.
Yeah.
Cheap plug. So.
Certainly.
But, so yeah, like there, and that's back then. Like I was talking about the Sheik, for instance. When the Sheik's territory was dying, I was reading Gary Hart's book, and he was talking about how he went up there to help the Sheik because the Sheik asked him to come help him. And his territory was dying. He said he got there and there was only 800 people in the building. You know what I mean? And now think about that. If you said that today, we would laugh at it, right? Because 800 people to a professional wrestling show, if you have 1,000 paid people to a professional wrestling show in 2021, then you are one of the top 10 independent promotions in the country, period. You know what I mean? So, and the fact that they're talking about 800 to 1,000 people being the absolute, it's so bad. This territory's dying. That shows how far we've gotten away from professional wrestling. So when people say, oh, the business is better than it ever was, like, bullshit. There's no concernable metric that can measure that makes sense. Money, people, viability. I mean, what? I mean, obviously, if you factored in inflation, can you imagine how much money was made in the territory days? I mean, you had promoters.
Oh, yeah.
You had promoters that were making $2, $3, $4 million a year. Back in the 60s and 70s. You know what I mean? So can you imagine what it would be with inflation nowadays?
Absolutely, it's a totally different world. And I guess one of the things to kind of acknowledge, this is a good place to acknowledge, is when we talk about that was a time when the primary source of revenue was the gate.
Yeah.
And because that's where you made your money. For instance, in Memphis, which I'm going to reference obviously because of where I grew up, the Saturday morning television show that we all love so much was really essentially a glamorized commercial for the Monday night matches.
Yeah, it was an infomercial for that.
That's really what it was. It wasn't about the show itself. It was about the thing you're promoting that we were going to have happen on Monday night.
And the thing is, too, if you watch ECW, right, they did the exact same thing. That was pretty much, their program was pretty much an infomercial for their live events, for their shop, for their, whatever, the training school they had, all that kind of stuff factored in. They was just, hey, this is where we are, this is what we're doing, that kind of thing. That's what you're talking about with Memphis. Like Memphis, a lot of people don't realize, too, that, like, if you were a star in Memphis, then you didn't get paid for television. Right? But if you were a job guy, if you were a guy that just got beat all the time, then they paid you pretty well, I think, to work on the bottom of that because you weren't going to get any redemption.
Right. You're not going to get the Monday night match. You're there to promote the Monday night match.
Yeah, exactly. So the guys would make their money on the towns, the stars would, and they would do TV free, and that was a very frequent thing throughout the business. They did it in Crockett, they did it, I believe, everywhere.
Well, yeah, it makes sense. You understand you're going to get paid, A, off the large house you draw, and B, I'm sure they all had merchandise available for the fans as they left the arena, I would think, to a large extent. Well, I suppose the baby faces would.
Only the baby faces.
The baby faces would.
And that was the thing, too. Like,
myself.
there were some instances where heels would get paid more, like, guaranteed money.
Right.
Because the babyface was going to make money and then make gimmick money on top of it. So, but obviously it takes the heel to make the babyface and vice versa. So, you had to compensate them somehow.
Because the babyface has a revenue source
yeah.
that the heel does
and
not.
And I've heard of situations where a babyface takes half of his gimmick money and gives it to his heel because
who helped make him.
Who helped make him for that night or whatever it was.
Oh, that certainly makes a great deal of sense.
Yeah.
And I do want to go from this because what we're really talking about is the impact of television on professional wrestling. And this is, it hits on what's a sore subject for me. I'm going to draw a contrast to the larger, I'll say, national companies, in particular to the WWE. I know that the bulk of their revenue now is the television contracts, and in my opinion, the live audience has become an afterthought. When I attend their events, and I do from time to time, I haven't lately, but when I have throughout my lifetime, I've always felt like the audience was almost treated as part of the scenery or the backdrop. Oftentimes the performers in the ring don't necessarily reference the audience at all or attempt to involve them in the matches. It's all about playing to the camera. We obviously see the example of, the 2 count where, when you have someone kick out at 2, there's going to be the zoom close-up on the person as they go into shock that someone just kicked out at 2. And they will stop there sometimes for several seconds to get that. And that's a television thing. I can almost hear it now. The one, Kevin Dunn is the name I always hear as their primary director, producer, whatever you want to call him. I can almost imagine him in the booth saying, "Oh, get a tight shot on that. We want to get the reaction shot." Because he's a television guy, and he's about making a television show. And my constant thing, as I've said before, is that I consider professional wrestling the ultimate audience participation event.
Yep.
And I think that is one place where the WWE has constantly been lacking. That the territory days, it was viewed much differently. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're talking about, too, is not only are they really surprised that the person kicked out at 2, this is like the 23rd time that they kicked out at 2, yeah. And then, like, for some reason, they're still shocked. This one, that was the one that surprised me. After I gave him the first 22 moves, and I gave him this 23rd one, oh, my God, I can't believe he kicked out of those. You know what I mean? Like, it's just ridiculous. And that's what I said before. Like, wrestling used to be about you could be beaten by any move at any time, and now it's you can't be beaten by any move at any time. And it's creating the same drama, but it's creating from 2 different spectrums, and it doesn't work the way they want it to work now.
All right. Well, I don't know if I guess we have a moment. If you'll indulge me on this. For those of you listening, here's the example I would cite for you. On YouTube, you can find many tapes, or I shouldn't say tapes, but videos. I'm showing my age there. Many videos from the Mid-South.
What's a tape, Mark?
Right, what's that? It's Be Kind Rewind. You don't have no idea what that is. But the interaction of the audience. I would encourage you. Not too long ago, I watched a Terry Funk versus Jerry Lawler at the Mid-South Coliseum no DQ match on YouTube. I found it there. Yeah. And it's one of the things that I always loved when I would watch. I got to watch a lot of them on WBBJ in Jackson. On Saturday nights, they would replay those matches. But when Jerry Lawler would make his comeback, inevitably, I would hear the crowd as he swung, boom, boom, boom. They were in effect supplying their own audio, sound effects to it because they were so into it and involved. They were making what was the presentation. They were adding the part that, like if you're watching a movie, you're going to get the great sound effects, and in a live event, you don't necessarily get that. Mm-hmm. And so they were providing themselves, but it let me know how involved and how into what was going on. When he dropped the strap and made the comeback, you would hear them, boom, boom, with each right hand he delivered, and it just created such a great atmosphere as a viewer to know these people were into it. And the WWE mindset, to me, that is utterly lacking. And it disturbs me because I have those fond memories and they meant so much to me.
Yeah, and I've talked about this before. Like Daniel Bryan, when he got over, he was pretty much the only guy that was acknowledging the crowd. He would just looked at him and said yes, and all of a sudden became the biggest thing in wrestling. Well, imagine that. The one guy that's actually interacting with the people becomes the biggest babyface on the show. You know, things that make you go, as Arsenio Hall. I'm showing my age now. But, yeah, it's just the territories themselves, you know, I think that they just have a, obviously not everything was great. Like we talked about, they made mistakes. Lawler himself did a lot of very corny, hokey kind of gimmick stuff, you know, back in the day. But like I said, that was 1% of professional wrestling then. It's 90% now, and I think that's where the problem lies.
All right, I do appreciate letting me get those in there. Yeah, because, well, for instance, his affinity for involving the movie, I'll say movie gimmicks. That's the word I'm going to use.
The Mummy.
Those were things that he really loved for whatever reason, and he would invoke them, and it was over and over again, and it was something I just kind of worked my way through. I was like, oh, okay, hey, tell me when Dutch Mantel and Bill Dundee are coming out. You know, that's what I was looking forward to, because those are two guys I always enjoyed watching. And I guess it's because of how much professional wrestling meant to them, and it was clear in the way they, and that's something that bothers me when I see it lacking because some of the performers seem to take this for granted, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a fair assumption. I'm not going to dispute that at all. Like I think that if people had to make their money with an ass every 18 inches, like we talk about, like you said,
right.
Primarily the payoff came from the door, the gate. If that was still the case, I think a lot of guys would change their tune as far as what they feel is successful in professional wrestling. Because if they're not going to see it in their paycheck, you know what I mean, then it makes a little more sense to them. It hits a little more closer to home. But anyway, we're over time, just a tad, coming up on 32 minutes. For myself, the Golden Boy, Greg Anthony, and my co-host, Methodical, Mark Tipton. Thank you, and goodbye.